for joining us again. Nau mai hara mai, nau mai hoki mai. This is the second webinar in a series of 3. Me tīmata karakia, me karakia tīmata. Nau mai e raro, kia hā ki roto, kia hā ki waho. Kia tau mai te Māori tū, te Māori noho, te Māori tangata, te Māori atua, te Māori o rongo, te Māori e tū, te Māori e haumia tiki tiki, te Māori e hine o ahu one. Kia tau mai te ao. Kia hua mai, mā te katoa, Māori ora. Kia ora whānau, thanks for joining us again. If I can please ask you to disable any AI, that would be appreciated. And if you don't mind, if you can please pop your name in the chat and perhaps on whose tribal lands you are joining us here today, and no Hiakai. We have the lovely Jonathan, our comms advisor from Kore Hiakai, joining us in the chat, so he might post some questions to you. Kia ora, Jonathan. After this webinar, you'll receive a recording and any slides we shared, and if anyone's got any resources they want to share in the chat, we'll add that to the email we send out. And if you have any pātai, any questions for our speakers, please add them to the chat and I'll make sure they get heard today. Because we're doing such a taumaha subject, we want to ensure the richness of this kōrero is captured. And so we're going to produce a resource that will sit alongside this webinar. So that means that some of your kōrero might be added to the resource and anything you share in the chat in terms of pātai and responses to pātai, curious questions, and perhaps any feedback. So names won't be mentioned, but if you absolutely don't want that in the resource, then please just put a little brackets and say not for sharing. Mauri ora kia koutou. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon. So before we start, I know you've all left your workplaces or you're at home, so let's try and bring ourselves into the forefront and bring our attention to ourselves so we can enjoy the webinar together and be fully present. This is going to take a couple of minutes, so bear with me. Kia ora mai koutou. Kai. What is the difference between kai and food? Make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes, relax your shoulders and arms, soften your jaw, and I invite you to bring attention to your whole self. Let's take 3 deep breaths. Kia haupai ki roto. Kia haupai ki waho. Kia haupai ki roto. Kia haupai ki waho. And one last time. Kia haupai ki roto. Kia haupai ki waho. In your mind, take yourself to a place where you have seen, gathered, or experienced Waitangi and Kai. It could be your moana, your awa, walking in the ngahere, the marae, the community garden, or simply your backyard. It could also be your favourite place in your taiao, perhaps where light filters through the Kawa and Pūkenga and water sounds are close to you. There are many places of noho puku. Find one where you can focus on, and in your mind, find a tree you can lean against and sit down. I invite you, if you wish, to close your eyes. We are going to think about the word kai. Living beneath you is a vast mycelial network, threads of fungi connecting root to root, tree to tree, creatures that wriggle and burrow, nematodes twisting through mineral-rich earth, bacteria pulsing and multiplying, earthworms churning and aerating. Invisible yet tireless threads. They restore the Māori of Hiniahu one, turning decay into fertility, waste into renewal, death into nourishment. That is Kai, he Kai tino. We also consider what is beneath our waterways that sustain us, those creatures that dive, that cling, that float and paddle. Maybe inganga returning through ancestral memory, those creatures that filter and spawn, cleanse and migrate. We recognise the tides, the maramataka, and the vital role these play. Kai depends on movement, on seasonal return, on migration pathways, on our wai Māori. He kai tēnā, that is Kai. As we move to the surface of the whenua, we think about those creatures that crawl, that are puddling, those that plod, that have sprawl, that leap, those with 8 legs or more, 2 legs including ourselves, and those that have hoofs or paws, tails and claws, feathers and fur. Although we do not eat all of these creatures, they too are essential when we think about Kai. Without pollinators, we have no fruit. Without soil dwellers, we have no fertility. And without predators, we have no balance. He kai tēnā, that is Kai. Kai also refers to mahinga kai, to the species and materials traditionally used as sustenance, tools, rongoa, ceremony, and our survival. It includes fish, shellfish, our birds and plants, stones shaped for cooking and fire making, fibres woven into nets and baskets, natural pigments used for dye, rongoa drawn from our bark, leaf and root. It refers not only to the resources, but to the places they are found, the knowledge systems that guide the harvest, the stories handed down, and the actual act of gathering it itself. He kai tēnā. We lift our gaze between Ranginui and Papatūānuku, the open spaces where creatures that fly, that soar, that flutter and swoop. We look around us and see our flora and fauna. Without our trees, without our fungi, without our atua domains and land, we cannot breathe. The atmosphere itself, oxygen gifted by forests, carbon drawn down by leaves, moisture carried by winds across whenua and our maunga. When we use the word kai, we are referring to all of those creatures, to our atua, to our whenua, to our waterways. Picture in your mind some of those creatures, and let's do a little mihi to them. Bring your awareness back into the room. What have we missed? Is there something we haven't thought about? Please pop any thoughts in the chat about food and kai and the differences. But what we remember is food fills the stomach, kai sustains whakapapa. Kia ora. Mauri ora kia koutou. So hopefully you feel grounded and ready for our second webinar. Kore Hiakai are often asked what kai has to do with Te Tiriti or Waitangi, and we'd like to discuss and understand how we can authentically describe this in our mahi. So before we start, I just want to, if you didn't join us last time, I'd just like to ask Carwyn to introduce himself. If you don't mind, Carwyn, if you could just introduce yourself, please, and talk a little bit about the mahi that you're doing and that you've done in your area. Just keen for our listeners to understand our marehiri here today. Ngā mihi ki a koe, Carwyn. Kia ora.
Tēnā tātou, ko Carwyn Jones tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no ngā te kahununu ki te wairo, he kaimahi ahau o te Wānanga o Raukawa. So my name's Carwyn, and I work at Te Wānanga o Raukawa. I'm teaching to the Ahunga Tikanga program here, which is the Māori laws and philosophy program. And my background is in law, and I've worked primarily on issues relating to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Māori and Indigenous legal traditions, Indigenous rights more broadly. And as we're going to be talking a little bit today about treaty claims and settlements, also I worked at the Waitangi Tribunal and was one of the negotiators for our own treaty settlement in Wairoa. Kia ora koutou.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us, Carwyn. So we've got, hopefully Ngaio will join us. She might be a little bit late, so we're going to keep moving with this one. So I'm just going to quickly recap our last session. So Ngaio gave us an in-depth factual account of how we got here from the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And we discussed, she discussed kawanatanga versus sovereignty and tino rangatiratanga. She reminded us that the Te Tiriti was translated in less than 24 hours and that Henry Williams had translated He Whakaputanga before. And Carwyn discussed the promises contained within Te Tiriti and the relationships and why Te Tiriti was needed to ensure behaviour that set out the foundation in a statement to the rest of the world about the authority of our rangatira, and making it clear that they did not see sovereignty. He also, Carwyn also discussed tino rangatiratanga being more broader than that, about political authority and not necessarily just about political rights. He discussed tikanga and the role of tikanga in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And even though it doesn't have legal force within the state, it doesn't mean that there aren't real obligations. And I think this is really important, whānau. He also reiterated that both land and food play an important role in understanding the relationships and maintaining those relationships in the system of tikanga. So, kia ora, Carwyn. So, can you please start us off today and talk a little what you suggested around giving a bit of an overview of the tribunal, the treaty principles, the settlement process and redress. I mean, I know there's a lot, but please take your time because we would really love to hear your experiences and understanding and views. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Yeah, so I thought I've got a slide to share, which I'll put up in a moment, which and just one slide, but just as a bit of context, thinking about these issues around Kai, I think one of the reasons why it's helpful to think about the tribunal, the treaty claims process and the settlement process is because central to a lot of those is relationships with te taiao, with the whenua, and relationships between people, and so that there are real impacts on our food systems and on Kai and on Māori economies and all of those issues. And so I think it's just helpful to think, I think that's why it's useful to talk about what these claims are about, the way they're managed, and then the settlement process, but also the kinds of outcomes of settlements, the kinds of redress that are provided. Okay, so I might just share my slide if I can make that work. Oh, no, that's the wrong. Hold on. I'll just see if I can do this in a more sensible way. Here we go. Okay, so as promised, just one slide. And got an image on the slide there. That's Chief Judge Karen Fock. And so she's the current chairperson of the Waitangi Tribunal and also the Chief Judge of the Māori Land Court. So I guess just to begin with, the Waitangi Tribunal was set up in 1975 under the Treaty of Waitangi Act. So for those of you who were with us last time, Ngaio will talk to us about some of the events that took place in between 1840 and took us right up to 1975, and mention some of the kind of breaches of Te Tiriti that were involved in that period, including land confiscations, the operation of the Native Land Court. And then coming up to 1975 and the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal. Now, part of the reason why the Waitangi Tribunal is set up at all, or is necessary, is because there had been cases, and one kind of infamous case where the courts had said, famously, the Treaty of Waitangi is a simple nullity, so it doesn't mean anything. The courts had said in the 19th century that there were no legal obligations that came out of the Treaty of Waitangi. The court said, well, the government, they might feel like they have some moral obligations to live up to the promises they made in Te Tiriti, but they're not legally enforceable obligations. They're not the kind of thing that the courts could get involved with and enforce. And so what we have then when we're coming up to 1975, there's been increasing kind of direct action Māori protests. There was the Hiakai led in 1975, Whina Kupa, and this increasing pressure to have some legal recognition of Te Tiriti. And so eventually that leads to the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal as a body that could hear claims based on the Treaty of Waitangi, or more particularly the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and come to talk about that concept in a moment. There was obviously a concept that had a lot of discussion last year around the bill that was promoted by David Seymour. So
no surprises there.
Yeah. So first thing to note then is that the tribunal is set up by legislation. So Parliament has passed a law setting up this tribunal for the purpose of hearing claims based on Te Tiriti. And it's set up as a commission of inquiry. And this is quite important because first of all, it gives the tribunal actually quite significant powers in terms of being able to require witnesses to come and give evidence. And there was also some discussion in the last couple of years around Karen Chua, minister, who had sort of initially refused to appear before the tribunal, and there were questions around whether the tribunal could compel her to come and give evidence. So there's quite significant powers that a commission of inquiry has. Also, commissions of inquiry have quite a lot of flexibility about their own process and procedure. So what that means is that the tribunal's been able to kind of change and adapt its process over the 50 years that it's been in existence, to adapt to kind of changing needs of claimants in particular. But it's also meant that the tribunal's been able to do things like hold hearings on marae, to incorporate aspects of tikanga into its own process. It also means being a commission of inquiry means that it's different to a court, although there are in lots of ways it operates quite a lot like a court. You know, there are lawyers that present their arguments and there's evidence produced and witnesses are cross-examined and so forth. But different to a court is this what we often talk about as being an inquisitorial function. So the job of the tribunal is not just to come to a decision about who wins the case and provide some reasons for that, but it's intended to inquire into what happened, to be active, not just listen to the arguments that's put forward to it, but to draw on the knowledge of the tribunal members themselves and be active in inquiring into and exploring what's actually happened and to make findings and recommendations about that. And so that's a little bit different to the way in which a court operates. I should just note with the Waitangi Tribunal members that they are, initially there were only 3 Waitangi Tribunal members in 1975. Now that's expanded so that the tribunal has a chairperson, currently Judge Fox, and can have up to 20 other members at any given time. And those members, they don't all hear one particular claim at a time. First of all, the claims tend to get grouped. We've seen with historical claims, they might get grouped into a geographical district. So all the claims in a particular area are grouped together, or sometimes with claims which are based around a particular kaupapa or a theme or subject. They'll be grouped according to the subject matter. But also you might have a panel of maybe 5 Waitangi Tribunal members who will hear those claims. So they don't all hear all claims. Now, the tribunal members, some of them are Māori Land Court judges, like the Chief Judge, and they will sit as Waitangi Tribunal members. And the other tribunal members, they're required to be, in terms of their appointment, they're appointed both for their knowledge and expertise of matters likely to come before the tribunal, but also their personal attributes. So it is very much intended that this is a body of people of mana, and people with background knowledge and expertise in the kinds of issues that come before the tribunal. So as well as the Māori Land Court judges, people with that kind of legal background, we also have people who have expertise and knowledge in tikanga Māori, te reo Māori, the history of particular iwi and hapu. We have other kinds of historians and geographers and people who are involved and have experience in public policy, sometimes including former MPs have been appointed to the tribunal. And they are expected to bring their expertise to the matters that are in front of them. Now, one of the other kind of really significant things about the Waitangi Tribunal is that also in the legislation, in terms of the appointment of members, it talks about having reference to the treaty partnership. And so that's sort of generally been interpreted as meaning that there ought to be kind of roughly the same number of Māori and non-Māori members of the tribunal at any one time. And that's quite a significant feature, and was in 1975 a really groundbreaking aspect of this tribunal, that you would have a body that was looking into Indigenous claims, and that the body would also be made up of Indigenous people, or include Indigenous people amongst its membership as well. The claims themselves, just the kind of technical requirements of the legislation. So only Māori can make a claim to the tribunal, and the claims are always about something that the Crown has done or not done. So it's always about some government action or failure to act. And it claims have to allege that there's been a breach of the principles of the treaty, and that's led to some prejudice, some burden, some bad effect as a result of the action or inaction of the Crown. And the concept then of the principles of the treaty becomes really important and central. And if you were tuned into a lot of the discussion around David Seymour's Treaty Principles Bill, you might have heard that one of his kind of key concerns was that Parliament hasn't defined what the principles of the treaty are. And that's certainly true. In the Tribunal's legislation, in the Treaty of Waitangi Act, there's no definition about what the principles of the treaty are. There's a direction to the Tribunal that they need to look at both the Māori text and the English text, and then develop from that text what they understand as the principles, and use that as the kind of measuring stick for the claims. And it seems, when you look back at the discussion in Parliament in 1975, that was quite an intentional move. that what Parliament didn't have in mind that there was going to be a set list of principles that would be applied. What it wanted to do was to say, don't just look at the English text, or don't just look at the Māori text. You need to look at both and figure out what are the kind of underpinning ideas that apply. But also, don't just think about it in the context of 1840, but try and think about what that relationship that was formed in 1840 would look like when you apply it to current issues. And so that's why they use this idea of principles, is to direct the tribunal that when you're looking at these claims, you need to be thinking about the underpinning ideas, not a kind of narrow or technical reference just to the text itself. And the other sort of aspect of thinking about what the tribunal's work is here is that the tribunal is intended to apply treaty principles, make findings and recommendations about those. When it was first set up in 1975, it didn't have any historical jurisdiction, so it couldn't look back at things that the Crown had done or hadn't done before 1975. And so, when Ngaio talked about last time about those land confiscations, the raupatu that took place, or the actions of the Native Land Court, which were really effective in removing Māori land from Māori ownership, those things all happened before 1975. And so there's this big loss of the land and authority in relation to natural resources, which happened before 1975. And at the time the tribunal was set up, it couldn't look at those historical issues. It could only look at current policy and assess that against the principles of the treaty. Yeah. But because of those, that it was in that historical period that a lot of the really major concerns, or that there were a lot of major concerns about, in 1985, the tribunal's jurisdiction gets extended back to look at anything that happened from 1840 onwards, from the signing of Te Tiriti. And I think that's just, I wanted to just note that point, because I think often when we think about the work of the tribunal, because it's had this big focus for many years on those historical claims, that we tend to think about that's what it was set up to do. And in fact, when it was first set up, it was set up to look at current contemporary policy kinds of issues. So it has this requirement, sort of mandate, to assess claims about breaches of treaty principles. And the tribunal has, when it's looked at the English text and the Māori text and the context in which those were signed, written, that relationship was entered into, it's come up with a number of different principles. I've just got on the slide there 3 which are kind of well recognised, and which the other courts have applied as well. And the central one there is really this principle of partnership. And this really comes from the fact that, when you look at the authority that's being granted to the Crown in kāwanatanga, as we talked about last time, that authority of governmental authority there, and then the authority that's being retained or guaranteed to Māori of tino rangatiratanga, then you've got a situation where that kind of public power is being shared in some way. And Te Tiriti doesn't set out all the detail of what that's going to look like in every situation, but it's clear there's a relationship where there's some sharing of power, and that's why the tribunal says, we ought to think of that as a partnership. As I say, it's also language that the courts have used as well. And the kind of key idea there is that the treaty partners ought to act towards each other with utmost good faith. And so that leads to a whole range of things about how you ought to engage and consult and involve in decision making and all those kinds of things. Another aspect is this principle of active protection, and that really comes from those, as we talked about last time, the Article 2 guarantees tino rangatiratanga in relation to taonga, and because those are framed as really positive guarantees, there's a sense that the Crown has an active duty to ensure that anything that's covered, any taonga that's covered by Article 2, that those things are actually protected and maintained. And sometimes the difference between a kind of passive obligation there and an active one, might be to say, well, even if the Crown itself isn't responsible for harm done to a taonga, it's actually got an obligation to protect that taonga from everyone else, and to maintain it as well. So it's an active duty.
Yeah,
and then
can I just sorry,
yeah.
can I just
Yeah.
don't mean to interrupt. Just can you explore taonga in relation to Kai? And so could you touch on if you can touch a little bit on that. And I think Ngaio's just joined us, and so I'll jump over to Ngaio to introduce yourself further on down the track. But if you because often we we talk about Kai as taonga, our waterways as taonga, land as taonga. What's the relationship between taonga and Kai?
Yeah.
Mihi ana. Kia ora koutou. Aroha mai. I got stuck in the rain in Littleton. I'm going to blame my port life on everything and why I'm late. And I'm in the hoodie like a millennial. Just got to be that young rangatahi for this kaupapa. Aroha mai. Ko Ngaio tōku ingoa, e whakapawau ki ngā tangata o Ngāti Tiata Te Waiohua, me Ngāti Whatua, me Ngāti Parau, me Waikato hoki. E tipu aki au e o tautahi, e noho ana au e o hini hau e nai nei. Sorry, I've literally run in from the rain to join this Wānanga, and I'm so excited to hear what Carwyn has to say. In terms of what we're talking about with the second article, in terms of taonga, in terms of Kai, I spoke about this last week when we were at the Underground Festival, and we were talking about soil and everything. And I always think about tangata whenua, like we are tangata whenua, we are the whenua and the whenua is us. So when everything comes down to being litigated to the second article, I always think about how we are the whenua and the whenua is us. So that's just my 2 cents in terms of Kai and what we're talking about with Te Tiriti or Waitangi. But I'm super excited to hear more about Carwyn's nerdiness.
Kia ora Ngaio. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, one of the things that the Tribunal has recognised, and the other courts have recognised as well, is that when we're talking about taonga, we're not only talking about physical concrete resources. So yes, land as something tangible and concrete is a taonga, but also thinking about our relationship with whenua, thinking about some of the things that the Tribunal has recognised, te reo Māori as a taonga, or thinking about kāinga, as being something that fits within that concept of taonga. So kāinga in terms of I guess home is one way of thinking about that, but encompassing that idea of connection with the whenua, of community that results from us being connected to a particular place, those kinds of ideas. Or hauora Māori, thinking about health outcomes as being a taonga as well. And of course there are real connections to our kai in that space too, as well as when we think about the kind of physical aspects of the whenua, of the awa, of plants and animals and those kinds of things that are, and our access to them as being something, our access to them and ability to exercise rights and obligations that come from sort of kaitiakitanga, that sense of, or that ethic of stewardship or guardianship as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a partai for you. It's come up with me a lot recently, the concept of kaitiakitanga. How do you feel about that kupu, Carwyn?
Yeah.
And how do you feel about like distributing it as a kupu?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. And, it's, so there was a bit of discussion about this in one particular tribunal inquiry that I had some involvement with, in the Y262 inquiry, which had a lot of had a lot of connections to thinking about different kinds of taonga, including this kind of central part of that inquiry started from thinking about kumara and the mātauranga, the knowledge associated with kumara. And the tribunal in that inquiry uses kaitiakitanga as a framework for thinking about the relationships that exist between people and a taonga, and the kind of the rights and obligations that adhere there. And the tribunal addresses this a little bit in its report. It says that we know that this is not necessarily the way that we know that historically we might not have talked about people as being kaitiaki, or living people as being kaitiaki. Historically we might have, the use of that word kaitiaki might have been for sometimes maybe something like a taniwha, so a supernatural guardian, or sometimes maybe like an animal species might be considered to be, they actually might be the kaitiaki, the guardian or steward. And it's, the tribunal says, we know that this is applying it in a sort of different way, but we want to draw on that idea of what's underpinning it. And because it's an idea, it's a word that's been deliberately kind of adopted by some Māori from, Māori environmental, Māori who are wanting to inject a Māori environmental ethic into environmental decisions about te taiao that were being made, adopted that language of kaitiakitanga to try and give expression to that. And so for those reasons that the tribunal says, we think we can use it in this context. We know that it's not necessarily a historical or traditional way of using that idea, but we think it's come to be important, particularly in the discussion of kind of law and policy in these spaces around how it gets used. Now, one of the real concerns obviously is how kaitiakitanga, when it's used in, for example, the Resource Management Act, and then starts to be interpreted and applied by the courts, kind of gets flattened out and loses some of the important dimensions that we're trying to capture. So, I think that there's a real caution there, and understand some of those concerns about the use of it in those spaces. Yeah.
Awesome to hear your whakaaro about it. I was taught my kuia, Naniko Minhinik. She was part of Indrip and everything. I'm sure you're familiar. she always taught me that the use of the word kaitiakitanga was with people that were working on their land and looking after it. And it's been a really interesting development in the most recent years, how people have been reappropriating the word. So it was just really lovely to hear your whakaaro about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, kia ora. Yeah.
Kia ora. Just got a question. Does the tribunal still operate on the principles?
Yes, yeah, it does. So the tribunal, again, there's no kind of definitive set of treaty principles, although there are these kind of well-recognized ones that the tribunal uses. But the tribunal, because each panel is kind of listening to a new inquiry, it's not required, again, there's a difference from the courts, so it's not required to hold to a strict precedent in the way that the courts are. So it's up to each tribunal panel is able to develop these principles in the way that it sees fit or applicable to the particular claim in front of it. Now, there's a real consistency in the application of, the principles of partnership and active protection, those kinds of ideas. But one of the things that we have seen often in relation to where the tribunal's dealing with issues relating to, say, social services of some kind or social well-being is that they've recognised that equity is a principle of the treaty. Also recognised, being used in a number of inquiries, this idea of options. So the sense of, this is both sort of reflecting on Article 2 and Article 3. So the sense that Māori are entitled and have the guaranteed authority of tino rangatiratanga, and so ought to be able to participate or receive social services in ways that are consistent with that, but also that Māori under Article 3 are entitled to receive services like any other citizen, and so have an option also to participate in what we might talk about as sort of mainstream services too. So the tribunal says there's a kind of principle of options that comes out of that. They also use other ideas like kind of mutual benefit as well, that as an underpinning idea of Te Tiriti, those kinds of things. So there's not a specific list, but that's the framework that the tribunal uses to assess claims.
Yeah, just got one more patai. While our people are, organising and looking for evidence, collecting evidence, collecting data, interviewing kaumātua, who pays for that? Like, who's paying for iwi Māori to collect that evidence, while the tribunal have got kind of a whole raft of resource behind them?
Yeah, so the tribunal will, in some inquiries, will commission research to be the kind of independent research, independent from any other parties. There's also particular legal aid provisions that are available for Waitangi tribunal inquiries, which does allow for expert evidence to be provided, and so that when we talk about experts, we're not just talking about people with PhDs, but we're talking about those as community members, people who hold knowledge around particular communities as well, and lived experience and those kinds of things. So there is some funding available there, and then when we come more into the settlement process, there's also funding that has been available. There's some funding that comes directly from through, back to calling the Office of Treaty Settlements again, some funding that's available from what's called the Crown Forest Rental Trust, there's also often what happens in the settlement process too, and the negotiation process, is that there'll be a sort of an advance on the settlement provided, which, you know, is to my way of thinking, I think is a sort of slightly questionable approach, in the sense that you know, you're having to use up your own settlement redress to get to a point of settlement in the first place. So I think there's you know, there are some, and funding often, you know, is a real issue in terms of you know, in terms of pressuring groups to get to a settlement, because, you know, if your funding runs out, then it becomes very difficult to continue negotiations with the Crown. Now, the Tribunal doesn't have huge amounts of resources, because the Crown prefers to put its resources into actually that settlement end of the process. So it's a kind of different part of the Ministry of Justice, which negotiate with claimant groups to reach an agreement, a settlement agreement. Maybe just very briefly talk a little bit about that settlement process. So what the Tribunal does is it hears these claims and it makes findings and recommendations to the government. So it'll make findings of where the principles of the treaty have been breached and what the government ought to do about it. And as I say, it looks at it has looked at historical claims, but it's always had this jurisdiction to look at contemporary claims as well. And that's now really its focus, as the historical claims are being finished up, is looking at kind of current policy issues. And we've seen a number of issues that the policies that the current government is trying to progress, which have come before the Tribunal in the last couple of years. But the Tribunal...
it's diplomatic of you there, Carwyn.
What's that?
That was very diplomatic of you.
Yeah, I thought so too. Tika tira.
Yeah. And the Tribunal makes mostly non-binding recommendations. So it provides recommendations to government that the government can either choose to accept or to ignore or reject. And so there's a limited exception to that. Probably don't need to go into the technical details of all of this. It comes out of some litigation in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and provides for where there's former state-owned enterprise land or Crown forest land, that the Tribunal does have some powers to make binding recommendations that that land be returned, but the Tribunal has never fully exercised that power. So it's sort of there in the background, but hasn't actually ever been put to use.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Mostly...
Sorry, go, Haudishani.
Yeah, mostly non-binding. I think that's the kind of central point. So I think that's important for us in some of the current discussion where we hear the government saying, well, the Tribunal, what authority does it have to talk about, you know, decide on constitutional issues? Well, actually, all it's doing is hearing evidence, making findings and recommendations to government, and it's up to the government whether they act on them or not. So can't force the government to do anything, really.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of trade-offs, you know, that iwi are required to make for settlement process, and you've given examples of some, and even before they get to the settlement process, they're having advances on their settlement. So there's, you know, the enormous pressure to settle quickly so that they don't exhaust that resource. And so that, yeah, it's just want to acknowledge all those trade-offs that our people are continually facing with this process that we ultimately didn't have a say in and was forced upon us.
And the Tribunal has kind of done its best to try and adjust to that. So, for example, it recognised that these big historical claims, the inquiries were taking too long, and so tried to think about sort of tailoring an inquiry process where you might sort of hear a first stage of it, and hopefully that would then enable give the claimants enough to negotiate with the Crown, but that if they couldn't reach a settlement, then they can come back to hear the next stage and so forth. So the tribunals tried to adjust its process to try and meet the needs of claimants, to not drag things out for too long and exhaust resources. But after the tribunal has heard its inquiry in historical claims, then it passes off to another part of the Ministry of Justice, as I say, the Office of Treaty Settlements, who negotiate directly with the claimant groups. And that's a long and involved process, and one in which, as Moko, as you sort of mentioned, that is really a process that's framed by, you know, what the government wants to do, what the Crown wants to do in terms of settling these claims and removing its own liability. And they originally, you know, they were, well, these claims are set up as being full and final settlements of all historical claims. And so, you know, that places, I think, probably an unhelpful kind of framework if actually what you're wanting to be doing is resetting a relationship that's going to be ongoing. You know, that sort of language of full and final seems like you're ending a relationship. And, you know, as Moana Jackson always talked about, you know, treaties are not made to be settled. They're made to be fulfilled. You know, the agreement and the relationship is meant to continue. So just to give a little bit of a sense, and hopefully leave a little bit of time for a few more pātai, but just a bit of a sense of what's involved in treaty settlements, or what the outcomes are, is that they have these three types of redress that are involved, which are referred to as historical, commercial, and cultural redress. The historical redress is often quite hotly contested. This is a sort of agreed historical account about the relationship between the Crown and the particular group that's settling. And that's the basis for the Crown acknowledging breach of the treaty and formally apologising for those treaty breaches. The commercial redress is relatively straightforward, and that's, you know, probably if you hear sort of headline figures of dollar amounts, that's what the commercial redress is. So it's intended, it might be made up of cash, or it might be made up of return of land that's of commercial value, or anything else of commercial value. Sometimes there was talk of shares in state-owned enterprises when the power companies were being partially privatized. But those are intended as kind of monetary compensation, but should be aware that it's very far from full compensation. The amounts have largely been in the region of sort of 1 to 3% of the value of land taken, that being returned to Māori. So it's a very small acknowledgement of those commercial loss there. And then there's a whole range of cultural redress, and these include things which are not intended to have commercial value, but are often about a kind of either joint management or co-governance over particular sites. They might be relationships with Department of Conservation, which might have a big impact on maybe Kai, but I'm thinking certainly the access to other kinds of plants and animal materials and those kinds of things, but the way in which dock sites in those areas and the claimant areas are managed, and provide some input from the local iwi in that, but also a range of other relationship agreements with other government agencies and departments and things. And so it's in that area that, and including local government, and so it's often in that area that there's some of the most kind of interesting or innovative things come out of the settlements, and probably particularly for thinking about, you know, these issues around Kai, around community, recognising the impact on, for example, the taking of land, the ways in which that disrupts not only a sort of economic resource, but also community relationships, the food systems and local economies and those kinds of things. So cultural redress can sometimes help to address some of those kinds of things.
Yeah,
Okay,
I mean, it's also kind of like, you know, I guess, you know, can historical injustice really be resolved through financial compensation alone? Because, you know, especially when whenua and Māori are central to, you know, our Kai systems. And so what we're really looking forward, what we really want is, yes, financial compensation, but kind of you know, to honour the Te Tiriti partnerships. And I know a lot of iwi have partnerships with, say, local councils or with DOC or Crown agencies, but maybe not enough. Like maybe not enough. Maybe the power sharing isn't as balanced as what it could be. I just want to quickly just plug this. There's a really good resource. I'll pop it in the chat, and this is the Hiakai Hiakai. So this is a report of evidence presented by Te Waka Kai to the Waitangi Tribunal into the Wai262 claim, and it's got a lot of you know, Crown failures in it, but it also has, which I think is really important, to have recommendations. And so the recommendations aren't necessarily financial. Some of the recommendations are, you know, not to introduce genetic engineering into our whenua. And so, yeah, the recommendations are equally as important. Kia ora, aroha mai. Go, Ngaio, over to you.
I was going to say that Carwyn stole my line.
Which was, let's repeat it.
That 1 to 2% of what treaty settlements are actually is what our whānau get. So they get 1 to 2% of what was actually taken in originally. And so, yeah, that's a big line for me. I think it's a mic drop.
That's a billboard.
Yeah, and the other thing too, just picking up on what you're each saying there, is that, you know, often the financial compensation, it's problematic that it's so small. We to recognise that, but also that's often not the key focus for iwi. You know, I know, and I'm pretty sure this is the same everywhere. Like I know with our community, when we said to people, "What do you want out of the settlement?" the overwhelming response is, we want the land that was taken back. You know, we want that whenua back. And often that's not actually possible within the Crown settlement framework, because either the land's now in private hands, or like in
like
our
in
area.
the Waiponamu, particularly with the Kaitahu settlement, the way that's worked with DOC, you know, it's very different down here as well.
Yeah. And also actually that's part of the reason why some of the current changes in terms of the Resource Management Act and the new planning bill and a natural environment bill are concerning in relation to Te Tiriti, is because a lot of these settlements are really plugged into the kind of current framework and are about enhancing participation through the current framework. And when that gets changed, that is, I think, going to have an impact on actually what the effect of these settlement agreements can be, or those relationships look like.
Yeah. I was just reflecting before on the Ngaitahu and the Waikato and the Waitomo caves settlements compared to other settlements. I was interested to see what you thought about those, Carwyn.
So in what kind of way? What particular?
And how they've affected settlements post there, and how things have changed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the sort of other thing to think about in terms of, or recognise in terms of the settlements, is that because they are political agreements, they are always really contingent on what's politically acceptable on both sides at the time, and they are impacted by settlements that have come before. but I think, for example, I think that the Waitahu and Waikato Tainui settlements being the first two really to go through a settlement process did set a bit of a framework for what followed. But then we've also seen a development around the ways in which these kind of co-governance arrangements have been able to develop on through that time as well. And like I say, those are some of the spaces where partly because there isn't a financial cost or a significant financial cost to them, the government's more willing to negotiate and be creative and think about what might be actually most wanted or needed in those kind of areas by the particular groups involved. And we've seen some of the really significant developments of things in terms of the new arrangements around Te Urawera and the Whanganui River, Taranaki Maunga, recognition of legal personality in those spaces as well. But there's also real inconsistency in the government's approach, because we were going through our negotiation at the same time as Whanganui River negotiations were happening, and we knew what was happening there, and we said to the Crown, well, our awa is just as important to us as theirs is to them. We'd like the same kind of arrangements, and they were not interested in talking with us about that at all. So
that's that's like just changing the rules or changing the game, like that doesn't sit well at all, does it? To watch another iwi going through that process. And also it's good to learn to see what other people have negotiated as well, and sometimes when land is returned, it's not necessarily suitable for rebuilding Māori food systems because the whenua has been so degraded, environmentally, and perhaps economically, or it's landlocked. So sometimes we can technically own land, but it's not easily usable towards kai motuhake, because of regulation and barriers and infrastructure gaps. So
and all those aspects, and often too, often some of the land that the Crown has available to return in settlements is from the Department of Conservation, from the or other kinds of reserves, and usually if that land is returned, it comes back with particular conservation requirements still applying. So, as you say, it means that you can't necessarily use it in exactly the way you want, because you have to continue to fulfill the requirements of a scenic reserve or whatever else it is.
Yeah, I just got another question, and I love the Te Awa Whanganui being recognised as legal personhood, like Pachamama over in Chile. I think it rippled worldwide and signified, innovation and a deep desire to protect the river. So that was awesome. Can you, what are some what have been some highlights? Like, can you please give me some highlights? What are some, because often thank you. We hear about some of the not so good things that happen, but like the river's a good example of a good one. Sorry, the question I also got was, there's been situations where iwi have been given back their maunga or something, and then they've given it straight back to the Crown. Can you just talk a little bit about that? But also, can you give me some wins, man? Give me some some innovative decisions that the Tribunal have made that have benefited our people and perhaps restored a bit of redress and given a bit of kaha to feel like they have settled, and maybe not settled, but received some compensation that's not necessarily monetary, but means they are closer to their whenua.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things to remember about the Tribunal is that although, as mentioned, its recommendations aren't binding on the Crown, and the Crown will often ignore or reject what the Tribunal says, one really important function that the Tribunal has played over its lifetime is a kind of public education about Te Tiriti, about our history, and really important. Often, one of the important things when the tribunal has an inquiry, the historical inquiry in a particular district, where it has those hearings on a marae, but also in other places in that community, that's an opportunity for those local communities to hear all that kōrero together. And those can be really helpful. But more broadly, one of the things, when you look at the way in which now it's generally accepted that there were, at least in the past, breaches of Te Tiriti, that there needs to be some redress provided for, which is now generally accepted. Even this current government and the most kind of right-wing elements of this current government all say that. That's partly because of the work that the tribunal has done in making that information accessible about our history, and that has been a big change over the lifetime of the tribunal. The tribunal's also, made really important recommendations in other kinds of areas, like some of its recommendations are in the Te Reo report from the 1980s, which recommended Te Reo Māori be an official language, that the Māori Language Commission, Te Taurewhiri Te Reo Māori, be established. And so that has had important impacts. And again, sometimes the tribunal's recommendations are not immediately taken up by government, but they provide a real platform for progressing those issues further down the track a little bit more. And sorry, what was the other part that you had?
So I might give you my peanut slab, but then you've got to give it back to me.
Yeah. So and so these are, again, this is partly a reflection of the political agreements. That treaty settlements are political agreements, and as you mentioned, Moko, that sometimes means that there's not as much consistency around these things as we would like, because it's about what can be achieved politically by both sides in the particular moment. And so I think some of those, having, say, a maunga returned and then gifted back, those are satisfying a kind of acknowledgement of where mana fits, but also ensuring that it's something which you can get agreement from government on. And we've seen, for example, with Te Urewera, we've seen those negotiations had almost completed for the return of Te Urewera to Tūhoe, and at the last minute, the then Prime Minister, John Key at the time, said, no, that's not politically acceptable. And so they had to sort of go back to the drawing board and figure out a different way of acknowledging Tūhoe's relationship with Te Urewera, which ended up in this quite creative kind of idea of Te Urewera having legal personality. So the land is vested in Te Urewera, so it's not owned by the Crown, it's not owned by Tūhoe, but it's vested in Te Urewera itself.
Kia ora. Yeah, kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you. No, do you want to add anything to that? We've just got a couple more minutes left, so I just thought we could wind up for a bit before finishing up. So I'll thank you, Carwyn.
Yeah, ka pai. I love talking about the Urewera claim. That's such an interesting one. It's so different from everything else. But what I always kind of use as my teaching method is the Ngaitirangi claim, because I feel like it's probably one of the most easiest way to break down a treaty settlement claim. 30 years, I was really lucky to be taught by Shay Wilson, and he talked me through all of the settlement that they did. But they were really smart with what they did with their settlement, and they went to the Environment Court and they got money to pay for their settlement. So they were building wind farms on their whenua, and they got to take them to the Environment Court and then pay for their Te Tiriti settlement as part of it. And I think that was such a smart way to do it, and just it was a different way of thinking about it, because we all know it's challenging and we all don't have everyone that can be that person that can represent people in terms of settlement, in terms of an iwi hapu level. And I think it's really important to look at the alternative ways that we can do things and find money and find pūtea just to help us keep going, because all we want is whenua back, and everyone supports all Māori support everyone. So I always just think about that Ngāi Te Rangi claim and how they did that. So intelligent and so smart, and I think it was a good way for the rest of us to look at when we're doing settlements in the future, just to get some pūtea. It's what we all need. Yeah.
Carwyn, any final words from you before you finish up? Thank you, Ngaio. You're on mute.
Aroha mai. Yeah, I mean, I guess that the thing is to recognise. For me, I find the settlement end of the process quite a flawed process. But it's it's touched on, that we see Māori communities, and I know this, from my experience with in Wairoa, is that we recognise the flaws in the process, but also try and think about what are the opportunities there. We know that this is never going to deliver to us our tino rangatiratanga. It can't, but can we use it as a platform for doing the things that we want to do? And that includes just to bring it back to the Kai stuff again. One of the things that have been happening with our settlement in Wairoa is that there's been one strand has been focused on kind of horticultural development, and yes, that's partly an economic thing, but the first crop of those the apples, as they were from one orchard, they were distributed back to our members, and so this kind of sense of reconnecting and participating in our food systems is part of what we can see, or what our community in Wairoa is looking to do.
Kia ora.
Yeah, kia ora. I think me and Ngaio might have to come to a visit up to Wairoa and check out the kai out there. I've got bones at Tamatirangi through Aotearoa Hamilton connection. So yeah, that's thank you both. Thanks Ngaio. I didn't doubt you at all. I knew you'd come sliding in at the last minute and jump on, easy as. So thank you so much. Whānau, thank you for joining us. That was a really robust discussion. And it's nice to have someone, both of you, with such in-depth knowledge and, a platform where we can ask those questions and grapple with some of the intricacies of the tribunal. So ngā mihi. Just want to really also acknowledge all our whānau who have been part of the settlement process, who perhaps never really got to see it through. So ngā mihi, ngā mamai aroha kia koutou. I know there's been a lot of whānau throughout the motu who have really spent time and energy and dedicated their lives to the settlement process and not being able to see it all the way through. So just wanting to acknowledge that. If I can get you both to stay on, that'd be great. So thank you, whānau, for joining us. Please send us any feedback, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for our third and final webinar, Te Tiriti o Kai, where we head into Te Ao Marama to rangatiratanga and discuss all the wonderful things happening around the motu. We're strong, resilient, and Indigenous. Mauri ora. Ka whakiria te tapu, kia waitea Aotearoa, ka tūriki kia whakataha ai, kia tūriki kia whakataha ai. Mauri ora. Kia ora whānau.
Kia ora.